All right, let's deep dive into this. Is India the next China thing? I mean, we're talking massive economies, 1 billion people each. It's easy to get lost in the hype.
It really is, and there's so much to unpack.
Exactly. So instead of just like crowning a winner, what insights did you find in the research that help us understand what's really going on?
Well, I think what's really interesting here is that it's less about saying one is better and more about understanding how these two economic giants are just fundamentally different. Different strengths, different challenges.
Right, right. And like everyone always makes that elephant in the room comparison, which, side note, always makes me picture an elephant trying to use chopsticks. Okay, but seriously, one thing that jumped out from the stuff you sent me was the sheer size of China's economy. Over $18 trillion. I mean, trillion with a T. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah. It's a hard number to even wrap your head around. And, it's easy to forget that China wasn't always this economic powerhouse.
Well,
They've really cemented themselves as, like, the factory of the world over the past few decades.
yeah.
But they're not stopping there. One of the articles you shared talked about their push into renewable energy. Like, did you know they're the world's largest producer of solar panels now?
See, that's what I love about these deep dives,
Sure.
those little details you wouldn't expect. But backing up for a sec, a lot of what I was reading talked about China's government playing a huge role in their economic boom. Like, how does that even work?
Well, yeah, it's definitely true that the Chinese government has a much more, let's say, hands-on approach to their economy than a lot of Western countries.
Right.
But I think there's a misconception that it was all just like top-down planning and that's it. One thing that I think often gets overlooked is their massive, and I mean massive, investment in infrastructure. We're talking roads, ports, high-speed rail, all the stuff that a modern economy needs to actually function.
Like the backbone, right?
Exactly. Imagine trying to run a business if you can't even get your goods to market reliably,
That makes total sense. It's like trying to bake a cake with no oven. It's just not going to happen.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does that compare to what's going on in India? I know they've got a booming tech sector and all.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a key difference. In contrast to China's more manufacturing-heavy approach, India's economy is a lot more driven by the service sector. So think like IT, software development, all those global consulting firms.
Right, right.
They've got companies like Infosys and TCS that are major, major players on the world stage.
Yeah, you always hear about Indian engineers being like at the forefront of all the tech stuff, Silicon Valley and everything.
Absolutely.
But like just looking at the numbers, it seems like India's economy is still quite a bit smaller than China's right now.
True. Significantly smaller, yeah. But those raw numbers don't tell the whole story.
Okay.
You highlighted some really interesting growth figures in the research you were doing. Like, they've been consistently hitting 6-7% growth, which, let me tell you, that's huge.
That does sound impressive. But I have to admit, I don't always have a good sense of what those percentages really mean in practice.
Sure, sure. Think of it like this. That kind of growth is like adding an entire Netherlands to their economy every year.
Whoa. Okay, that puts things in perspective.
Right.
But even with that growth, I'm guessing there are still some speed bumps along the way for India.
Oh, absolutely. Plenty of challenges, which we'll get into.
Okay, so we've talked about factories and software and all that. But what about the tech race? Like straight up, it feels like every day there's a headline about China's latest move in AI or 5G or whatever the future holds.
Yeah, and it's not by accident. It's really been a strategic push for them, for sure.
Right.
You mentioned those headlines. It's interesting to dig into why those technologies matter to them. For example, one of the things you flagged was about how China is really focused on becoming self-sufficient when it comes to semiconductors.
Right. Like that whole Made in China 2025 plan. I remember seeing that, but I'll be honest, I kind of skimmed over that part.
Yeah.
What's the big deal with semiconductors anyway?
Well, think of them like the tiny little brains inside pretty much every electronic thing these days.
Okay.
Your smartphone, your car, even your refrigerator probably has a few in there.
Yeah.
China's realized that if they rely on other countries for these crucial components, that's a vulnerability. Like, remember those global supply chain issues a few years back?
Oh, yeah?
Total chaos. So they're aiming to control their own destiny in the tech world, basically.
It was about more than just making cheaper stuff now.
Oh, for sure.
They want to be the ones inventing the next thing.
Exactly.
Speaking of which, where does India fit into all this cutting-edge tech stuff? They've got to be in the game, right?
Oh, absolutely. But that's where the story gets really interesting. You see, India's strength isn't so much about building the hardware. It's more about the brains behind the software. You mentioned all those Indian engineers in Silicon Valley, and they're not just there coding away for fun, right? We're talking about companies like Infosys, TCS. These are global giants in IT consulting, helping businesses all over the world to innovate, to streamline. It's a totally different ballgame.
Okay, so two tech powerhouses, but playing on different fields.
Exactly.
Makes sense. But one thing that stood out to me from what you were saying earlier, China's pouring money into research and development rate. I mean, one of the reports mentioned they're outspending India by a huge amount. Is that a problem for India long term?
Yeah. It's something to keep an eye on, for sure. It's like this, right? Think of R&D like investing in your own creativity as a country. It's how you discover new technologies, how you solve those really tough problems, and that's a marathon, not a sprint. So yeah, if India wants to be at the forefront of innovation, that gap in spending is something they'll need to
You
address.
can't just coast on being good at coding forever
Ah.
if someone else is building the next generation of computers.
Exactly. Which actually brings us to another fascinating part you were curious about, the people. Because it's not just about the money you pour into an economy, right? It's also about the minds you have powering it.
Right. We can't do this whole deep dive without talking about the billion-person elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Literally. Both of these countries have populations bigger than most continents. But what I was reading is that they're structured totally differently, like age-wise, right?
Absolutely. China is actually facing a bit of a demographic challenge with an aging population, whereas India, they've got this incredible surge of young people coming up. In fact, India is actually on track to have the world's largest workforce by 2027.
See, now that sounds like an advantage. Like you always hear about how a young and energetic workforce is good for the economy, so what's the catch?
Well, the catch, and this is crucial, is that it's not enough to simply have a young workforce. You need to have the right jobs waiting for them. Otherwise, you end up with a generation full of potential but nowhere to direct it.
So it's not just about being young, it's about being skilled and ready for the jobs of the future. Which kind of brings us back to that whole education and R&D thing we were talking about earlier. Like we've stumbled onto this perfect storm of factors, economic growth, tech innovation, this wave of young people entering the workforce. It makes you wonder if India plays its cards right. What could they actually achieve? Like, what's the potential here?
It really is mind-blowing to think about, but you hit on a really important point that playing their cards right it's not a guarantee by any means.
Right.
One of the articles actually it made a really interesting comparison. It said that for India to really, really harness this demographic dividend we're talking about, they need to focus on creating high-quality jobs. Not just any jobs, but jobs that are actually going to, leverage the skills of this new generation.
So more than just churning out factories, it's about building an economy that's ready for the future.
Right. Exactly.
But then we've also talked about how China's doing that too in a way with this big tech push. It feels like there's a lot of pressure on India to not just keep up, but to chart its own course at the same time.
Yeah, and that is the fascinating tightrope walk that they're facing. Because you're right, this isn't about India becoming the next China. It's about India becoming the best version of itself. I think it was in that same article, actually. They mentioned India's massive renewable energy potential. And, that got me thinking, imagine if they became a global leader in that field, for example.
Yeah, that's a whole different ballgame.
Right.
Instead of just following the same old playbook, they could end up writing a whole new one. This is giving me some serious food for thought.
Me too, me too. And I think that's the beauty of these deep dives. It's not about us sitting here coming up with all the answers. It's about asking the right questions.
So to wrap things up, if there was one big takeaway you'd want our listeners to walk away with, what would it be?
That's a good question. I think I'd say this. India has all the ingredients for incredible success in the 21st century. But that success is not going to look like a carbon copy of China's. It's going to be something uniquely Indian, driven by their own strengths, their own values, their own path.
I love that. Instead of, will India be the next China? The more interesting question is, what will India's own unique success story look like?
Exactly. And who knows, maybe one of our listeners will be part of writing that story.